Hello, this talk is called Finding Out What People Want. It's about how we develop our market research skills in the areas of chemistry and environmental science. My name is Dr. Kevin Parker of KKI Associates. I've been both a researcher and a commercial manager at an oil company, and I've had a subsequent commercial career as a consultant, during which time I've carried out literally dozens of market research assignments for new technology development projects. We could justifiably say that the 20th century was in many ways the century of chemistry. The development of things like semiconductors, antibiotics, petroleum products, polymers, nitrogen fertilizers changed the lives for millions, if not billions, of people. Advertising and marketing people like to talk about successful products, successful technologies bringing benefits to their users. And this is particularly true of 20th century chemistry. The invention of the transistor radio revolutionized the ability of people to listen to the music that I like where I want to listen to it. The ammonia plant changed the lives of many. It enabled us to feed the world so much more cheaply. Antibiotics kept us healthy when I might have been sick for years, or even in many cases dying. And mini cars, mini skirts, polymers and petroleum, they not only added an element of practicality to our lives, but an element of fashionability as well. These fashion items, underpinned by chemistry, make people feel good about themselves as well as being practical. So what kind of things might chemistry bring to us in the 21st century? Let's have a look at environmental issues, green issues if you like. Well, for a start, the International Energy Agency thinks we're going to have to double our world power generation capacity between 2010 and 2030. At the same time, removing a lot of fossil fuel power capacity and replacing it with renewables. There could be a role for chemistry there, couldn't there? There are huge opportunities to reduce the carbon footprint of most of the buildings in this country, especially when you consider that the difference between the best and the worst of our office stock, for example, isn't 10 or 20 or 30%, it's more like 500%. We're going to need chemistry to help us decide what to do with the fully 1/3 of all the food that we buy in the UK that's wasted. We need chemistry to help us calculate how much land is needed to grow enough biofuel to take off a jumbo jet. It's chemistry that helps us answer questions like, would we be better using that land to install photovoltaics or some other form of renewable energy? And there's plenty of opportunities for chemists in other areas of chemistry and medicine. While the Haber process was one of the great triumphs and successes of the 20th century, it's well to remember that the microbes in beans and peas can do nitrogen fixation at room temperature and pressure without costing us $1 billion a time. There's some previously rather esoteric areas of chemistry, like the contamination from rare earth mines, like the solution chemistry of the actinides, like the gas phase reaction between methane and hydroxyl radicals, have all become of a considerable technological and economic importance as we move into this century. And then, of course, there's the challenge of understanding biochemical systems well enough to reduce the development time and cost of getting drugs to market. All in all, it's easy to think of many reasons why chemistry continues to be an important topic as we go from the 20th to the 21st century. There are lots of opportunities out there. But how is it that we evaluate those? How do we find out which are the best opportunities? How do we find out which are the opportunities that really we shouldn't spend too much time and effort on? That's what I'm going to talk about over the next few slides. You might have heard, or possibly even been confused by, some of the jargon that's around the marketing and market research world. You hear people talk about market research, unique selling proposition, product development, and product management. I like to think about these bits of jargon in terms of benefits. For me, market research is about analysing opportunities to benefit people. People have a need, people have a problem, let's see if we can find out what it is. Unique selling proposition is about developing and articulating a benefit to a potential customer. This is what we could do for you, what do you think? Product management, product development is all about being able to deliver that benefit to the customer reliably and, most importantly, profitably. In market research, we make an important distinction: primary and secondary market research. Secondary market research is sometimes called desk research. It's finding out what's already there. It's using the internet, going to the library, just like the young lady in the picture. One of the sources of secondary market information for us are the reports published by market research companies such as Data Monitor and Keynote, Mintel. These are often found in university libraries or business libraries such as those found at the business gateways. Primary market research, on the other hand, is actually when you go out and talk to people. We sometimes divide primary market research into qualitative and quantitative, of which qualitative is much the most important for the kind of technology projects that we're involved in. Qualitative market research is finding out what people might want, finding out what their needs are, usually using a small number of interviews, but where each interview can be quite lengthy. Quantitative market research is usually conducted by professional market research companies. It involves a much larger number of shorter interviews and is usually designed and confined to the world of consumer products. I like to use secondary or desk research as part of my scoping studies. This kind of research gives me a feel for what the sort of potential market for a product might be. The most we could ever sell. It gives us a feel for who's buying, who's selling, tells us who the competitors are, lets us see if there's any patents out there, sometimes gives us price information. Most importantly, it can tell us reasons why the project is a complete non-starter. MarketResearch.com is a useful website. It lists commercially available market research reports across a number of industries. On the left you can see sections consumer goods, food and beverage, heavy industry and so on. And in the middle you can see the number of different biotechnology market reports have been identified. You'll see, for example, there's 160 reports on biopharmaceuticals, 321 on general biotechnology, 606 on drug discovery. Sadly, some of these specialised market research reports can be quite expensive, and as such they're unlikely to be in the average university library. However, there are a few tricks and hints you can use to get some of the information that you require. Firstly, there's always a contents page in these reports freely available. If they didn't put at least a contents page up on the internet, then no one would ever buy the report. Sometimes the mere presence or absence of a chapter tells you all you need to know. In the example here on microRNAs, I was doing a report a few years ago looking at potentially very major application of microRNAs. The fact that there was no mention of that application anywhere in the chapter headings, the section headings or the subsection headings was pretty good evidence that no one else in the world had spotted or was working on that particular application. The other advantage of being able to see the contents page is that sometimes you will realise you don't need all the 197 pages. Perhaps it's just one section or one chapter or even one graph that you need. In those circumstances, especially with older reports, companies will often do you a deal and sell you part of the report at a lower cost. Here's an example of some of the deductive analysis we can do with desk research. Supposing we have a technology that we're examining. It can tell whether blood supplies have been contaminated with CJD proteins, for example from mad cow disease or BSE. On one website we discover that the UK Blood Transfusion Service spends £70 million a year at the moment on treating blood to remove prions. And what that gives us is the maximum market potential for our technology. They're not going to spend more than £70 million, because that's what they're doing already, but they might spend up to £70 million for a more convenient and better method. On another part of the Blood Transfusion Service website, we discover that they collect around 2.5 million units of blood each year. Now, assuming they're likely to want to test each one of those, and the maximum potential cost would be £70 million, what that tells us is the total unit cost for a diagnostic test shouldn't be more than 70 million divided by 2.5 million, in other words, roughly £28 per test. For this technology, we might want to find out whether other people are developing competitive products. We might want to see who the main medical device manufacturers are, and it's fairly easy to find out who they are from an internet search. And it has to be said, as well as being potential competitors to us, some of these companies might actually want to buy from us. We might get a partner with them. Are these companies developing competing products and services to us? One way of looking is to see what they've patented recently. That's fairly easily achieved using the GB ISPASnet website, a link to which is on the UK Intellectual Property Office's website. And while we're looking at government websites and patents, we should also look at the regulatory environment for our product. In the UK, medicines and healthcare products are governed by the MHRA. In the United States, a similar role is carried out by the FDA. There is comprehensive information on both of those organisations' websites. One of the things we might want to do with this kind of research is to sanity check the project. If there are real problems with a potential project, then we need to know those problems early in the project's life. For example, we might be looking at applications involving use of the gas sulfur hexafluoride, which has great advantages of being both inert and extremely good electrical insulator. However, a problem revealed in our search is that sulfur hexafluoride is in fact banned in many countries, including the United States, because of extreme global warming potential. Similarly, if we were a small company or a university poised to enter the virtual lab market, the news that Microsoft were going to do the same thing might give us pause for thought and cause for concern. Moving on from secondary to primary market research, what we call qualitative research involves talking directly to users. The kind of information we can get from that involves user concerns, potential benefits, formulating product offerings and specification, and also finding out information about the value chain, business models, the market segmentation, user operability, and if we're lucky, to identify leads and launch customers. We'll talk more about some of these things over the next few slides. The process of qualitative market research involves speaking to users, sometimes face-to-face, but more often over the telephone. Although we have structured the interview with a series of questions written down in advance, we rarely read out the questions directly, but instead try to use the questions to guide the conversation. What we're looking for is the response along the lines of, "Funny you should ask that, that's a really interesting question." There are some examples of the kinds of questions that we might ask on the next slide. How do we identify people to talk to? One way is to use our own network. If everyone in the world, as they say, is separated by only 6 degrees of separation, we should know someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows someone who knows the answer. That's what we call the 5 phone calls trick. Typically, you might ask someone who... One way of shortcutting that process is to use trade associations and trade journals. For example, if we wanted to speak to someone in the chemical industry, we might use the Chemical Industries Association. If we wanted to speak to someone in the automotive industry, we might go to the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. These organisations, trade associations with their associated trade journals, can usually be researched during the desk research phase. Many business libraries have a list of trade associations. For very senior people, we may need to schedule the time for a conversation through their PA. But whoever we speak to, we try to be polite, we thank them for their time, we send them an email afterwards, and we always ask the crucial question, which is this: is there anyone else you think I should be speaking to? In many ways, doing qualitative market research of this sort is very similar to the skills that we would use in networking with people and job seeking. Here are some examples of the types of question that we might ask during a qualitative market research review. You can see that very few of them can be answered simply with the words yes or no. They're all designed to get people talking about their experience, expanding on it, while we unobtrusively take notes in the background. Towards the end of the interview, if it's going well, you can even ask very open questions like, what would you really like to see in a product designed to meet this requirement? What are the things that really make you worried? What are the things that keep you awake at night about your business? And as mentioned in the last slide, we always finish off with, is there anyone else I should be talking to? One of the things our qualitative market research should reveal is the extent to which customers want the same things. Are markets for the products homogeneous or not? For example, the chemical industry produces anti-corrosive pigments that are used in a wide variety of paints. Some of those paints are used on external structures like bridges, some in the cars, others in aeroplanes, others in white goods such as fridges and freezers. Some are used underwater in structures such as oil platforms. It's reasonable to expect that these different customers will have different requirements, different technical targets, and will be prepared to pay different amounts of money for their products. And differences are indeed what we find in the market for paint pigments. White goods, which are made of sheets of steel, painted and subsequently bent into shape, have a different requirement to aircraft, which are of course made of aluminium, or cars, which are made of galvanized steel. Immersed structures, like the legs of oil platforms, have different requirements to the parts of the superstructure of those platforms, at the air-water interface. If anything, the latter is a more difficult environment. And there are many specialist products as well. Touch-up paints, low-toxicity paints, colloidal zinc paints. The impact of this segmentation means that it's very difficult to predict market share and market value. Although the overall market might be billions, to get a consistent 4, 5 or 10% would mean you'd have to get 4 or 5 or 10% in each of those segments, or you'd have to take a much larger share in an individual segment. Marketing professionals distinguish the potential market, the total market for the product, the most that we could ever sell, from the served market, which is the portion of the market that we can easily get to ourselves with our particular product or service offering. I used the phrase product or service in the last slide. And one of the things that we have to find out from our market research, talking to potential customers, is how they would want to buy from us. Do they want to buy a physical item, a product, or would they like us to do some work for them, that is, deliver a service? You might think of it as the difference between, say for example, going to a supermarket or the corner shop to buy a physical bottle of Coca-Cola, that's buying a product, or going to a restaurant or a bar and have someone serve the drinks for you. We have to decide a way of delivering the product or the service in a way that makes sense to the customers but also makes financial sense to us. Investors, business managers talk about the business model. We can summarize it in these 3 questions. Who will we send our invoice to? What will it say that we've done to deserve being paid? And who is it that approves the payment or makes the buying decision? And when we look in more detail at real industries, we typically find a variety of business models. So generally, Scottish whisky, Glenfiddich, Glenlivet, these famous brands, actually are made in Scotland and are exported around the world, clearly a product business. Foster's beer, on the other hand, doesn't actually come physically from Australia most of the time. Typically, Foster's enter into agreements where they let other people brew or blend their beers. Coke do something similar, but typically you buy raw materials from them as well, so that you can blend exactly to their recipe. Both companies make money from their intellectual property by licensing their trademarks to business partners. And there are service models in the drinks industry. As well as the obvious ones, like restaurants and bars, there are companies who specialise in the testing of the quality and the safety of drinks. There are companies who specialise in the designing and production of drinks manufacturing plants, and there are many other forms of consultancy aimed at the drinks industry. All in all, it's quite easy to come up with half a dozen, if not a dozen, quite different business models just within this one industry. Why might companies want to adopt varied business models? Basically for sound commercial reasons. Companies selling high technology products, like Apple for example, tend to find if they sell a good product that the sales rise rather steeply after a short time, then level off as more and more people have it, and then start to fall as basically everyone who ever wants the new iPhone 4 or whatever has actually got one. The trick for product companies is to keep introducing new products so that that red curve that we see below keeps being supplemented by lots of other red curves a little bit displaced in time. On the other hand, a company like Rolls-Royce, for example, that makes jet aircraft engines, could sell a fairly small number of large, expensive jet engines a year. It's difficult, time-consuming and expensive to develop new jet engines. It's not something that you're going to do every year, and you're not going to persuade customers to install a new jet engine in the same way that a consumer might buy a new telephone. One option for a company like Rolls-Royce is to smooth out their cash flow. They could, for example, make it comparatively easy or more inexpensive to purchase the jet engine, but then make their money from servicing the engine, selling spare parts, selling consumables that have to be matched to the engine. A service business model can have more durable cash flow, as customers need you to provide the service over and over again. Of course, you can't impose your business model on a potential customer without consultation. Part of the remit of the market research process is to find out what business models customers will and those that they will not accept. There are at least 4 different common business models for companies in the chemical industry. There are the companies, mostly large and often multinational companies, that sell products, fertilizers, polymers, pharmaceuticals, intermediates, raw materials, detergents, reagents. Then there are the very often smaller companies that sell services, companies that do contract research and development, discovering the synthetic routes to a candidate drug molecule, companies that manage that design process, companies that do health and safety management, and the myriad of analytical chemistry labs. There are companies who sell a license. They design a product or a process and sell the right to make that product or exploit the process to someone else, usually for a royalty. And finally, there are the small startups, often small molecule development companies whose whole aim in life is to sell themselves, often to a larger, big pharmaceutical company. In the slide pack with this module, there is a case study, Shiny Teeth Limited, illustrating the issues faced by a small company as they decide the optimum business model for their future. For companies operating in environmental or so-called clean technology, we see many of the same business models as we do in the chemical industry. However, there are a couple of extra ones. Because clean technology is often providing a public good, not a benefit to specific individuals or companies, we might, for example, need to sell to the government or possibly to approach NGOs such as the Gates or Rockefeller Foundations who are interested in wider issues of development. One of the things that informs our decisions about the business model we adopt is what we can find out about the distribution or value chain in the market. 20 years ago, I was helping a manufacturer of industrial valves, ball valves used in the HVAC and the chemical industries for controlling the flow of fluids, possibly gases, possibly water. A friend queried the fact that these industrial valves were actually coming from Slovenia, what had been Yugoslavia. Was I not taking jobs or money from UK manufacturers? The answer, of course, was to show him this analysis. The manufacturer in Slovenia was receiving about 75 pence for each valve. They were selling to an importer, who then sold them on at £1.20 to a wholesaler, who then sold them on at around £2.50 to a retailer, who then sell them to customers and consumers for around £6. The first thing to notice is the manufacturer only gets about 75 pence of the total £6 selling price. And the retailer gets something like £3.50 of the total selling price. That kind of retail markup is actually pretty common in Britain, where it's expensive to own, run, rent or manage a shop. Looking at that value chain, you might ask yourself, why isn't everyone a retailer? Why would anyone want to be a manufacturer or an importer? The reason is, as you go down the value chain, although the margins increase, the volumes decrease. The manufacturer will be selling thousands of products at a time to the importer, whereas the retailer will be selling 1 or 2 products at a time to the final customer. There will be a trade-off, in other words, between sales margin and volume of product. And you need to decide where to position yourself in that value chain, bearing in mind the resources you have and the cost required of doing things like setting up retail shops. And then, of course, we can illustrate the attractiveness of the service business model by pointing out that the plumber or the service engineer who installs the valve will probably charge £60 rather than £6 for actually doing the installation. The next thing we're going to talk about are informal as well as formal market requirements, and we're going to use the metaphor of the chicken gun test. Sadly, despite the splendid picture, the chicken gun test has nothing to do with chickens and machine guns. What it is all about are bird strikes on aircraft. You can see on the left-hand illustration a picture of a jet engine after it's had a bird impact. You might remember the aeroplane that crash-landed in the Hudson River in New York a few years ago, where both of the engines were stopped after it struck a group of pigeons. It's expected that the engines will be damaged, even stopped, but what you don't want are pieces of engine coming out of the engine nacelle and through the fuselage, damaging the passengers, depressurizing the fuselage and causing a much worse crash. And the industry actually tests this. They have a compressed air gun called a chicken gun, and they do indeed fire dead chickens into aircraft engines on a stationary test bed. And if you don't believe me, there are some slightly graphic videos on YouTube about it. The chicken gun test came to prominence in 1970 when Rolls-Royce, then the most famous engineering company in the world, making both the cars and the aero engines, went bankrupt after the end of a long chain of events, the first of which was their new RB211 engine failing the chicken gun test. The RB211 was the first commercial application of carbon fibre. The mistake that Rolls-Royce actually made was to do the chicken gun test near the end of the development project rather than early on, just to see what would happen with such new technology. Internet stories that they forgot to defrost the chicken in this case are unreliable and can be discounted. In 1986, Tom Peters, the management guru, wrote a little article saying that if you think about it, most new technology projects have something like a chicken gun test. You might need to design things to operate well in bad weather, cold weather. If you were designing something like the Titanic or the Space Shuttle, you might need to design in a degree of robustness. For example, if you want to put electronics into any environment that shakes or vibrates. You might need to consider the ergonomics, the usability of your technology. If it's electronics, think about the readout, think about the dial size, think about the handles. When I worked for an oil company, we once had a product rejected by the market, particularly in Japan and the Far East, because of its smell. We'd put a chemical in there, which was undetectable by most of us, but which to Japanese people smelled offensive. Sadly, we had no Japanese people involved anywhere in the development team. All these things are examples of chicken gun tests. Very often they won't be written down anywhere, but will only come to light in discussions with actual potential users. As a technology consultant, I have a mental list of things that typically go wrong on technology development projects. With e-commerce, it's usually about delivery and payment. After all, what's Amazon but a very, very efficient mail order business? With biotechnology, on the other hand, problems usually arise from the time taken for development of the product and regulatory approval, getting through clinical trials. With environmental projects, it's usually a question of who's going to pay for what, after all, is very often a public benefit. For renewables and alternative energy projects, it's a question of numbers. What's the energy density like? Can we actually get enough? Can we plant enough biomass products to make significant amounts of biofuel? With software projects, there are often issues around managing the development team. And with chemical processes, what I often worry about is the tolerance of the process, especially a catalytic process, to feed impurities. More generally, I worry about companies whose business model is about selling large items to big customers. That always takes a long time. I worry about companies who haven't invested enough money and staff in their sales process. And I worry about companies who only have one thing to sell. And if no one wants to buy that one product, they're in trouble. So, with all the above points in mind, let's see whether we can critique these statements. The market for paint pigment is $10 billion a year. If we can get 1%, that's a market for $100 million. What's wrong with that? Millions of people in Africa need a diabetes drug. There's a vast potential market for us. What's wrong with that? No one wants speech recognition software. Sales in 2006 were only a few $1 million. And of course, most famously, as said in 1950 by the chairman, at IBM we only expect to sell a few mainframe computers per year. Now, clearly he was wrong. What was the reason? So, what should we have learnt from this lecture? A commercial opportunity exists where you can provide profitable benefits to enough people who can afford to pay for them. And every part of that statement has to be true. We have to provide benefits, there have to be enough people who can afford to buy them, and we have to be able to make a profit in that provision. In addition, we should have learned a few other points about market research and markets in general. Firstly, that there is a lot of information already out there, much of which is freely available. Secondly, we need to find qualitative information about what people want and quantitative information about how many people there are, what they might pay. An example of that was the little analysis we did for the blood transfusion service project, where we decided the test needed to be priced at £28 or less. When we looked at the market for industrial anti-corrosive paint pigments, we discovered that markets are rarely homogeneous. There is always a price-performance trade-off, in other words, segmentation of the market. One of the things that does is reduce the size of the market. Although the potential market for paint pigments might be in the order of billions of dollars, the served market that we can actually get to is typically rather less. One of the implications of that is we should always be skeptical when people make grand claims, like the market is billions and we just have to get a few % market share. I'm sorry, it doesn't work that way. We should now understand what people mean by the phrase business model and the difference between selling products and selling services. And finally, we should remember that whilst there are formal market requirements, for example, clinical trials for drug products, there are very often informal market requirements, and our mental shorthand for that is the chicken gun test. So that's the end of this lecture, and we hope that the information and the techniques you've gathered here will be useful both in the projects that you're about to do and in your future career. Thank you.